Hey kids, today we're going to be talking about a man named Erich von Manstein. If you don't know who he is, short story is that he was the Wehrmacht's best general during World War II and one of the best generals in modern history. Long story is pretty much this. Manstein was born on the 24th of November 1887 in Berlin. His original name was Fritz Erich Georg Edward von Lewinsky, which is way too long for any sane person to actually sit down and read. He was the 10th son of a Prussian aristocrat, Edward von Lewinsky, who was also an artillery commander in the German Empire. When Manstein was still a wee lad, he was adopted by his aunt or something like that, and was renamed to Erich von Manstein. Now both his biological and adopted fathers were Prussian military officers in the German Empire, as were his uncle and both of his grandparents. Paul von Hindenburg himself was Manstein's uncle, and Hindenburg eventually would become the Generalfeldmarschall of the German Empire's armed forces during World War I, and even the president of the Weimar Republic after World War I. Manstein began his military career in 1906 when he graduated from Cadet Corps in Gross-Lichterfeld. He was deployed to the 3rd Foot Guards Regiment as an ensign, which is pretty much the equivalent of being the water boy that gets throat-coated by the football team after a homecoming loss in the locker room. Then in 1907 he was promoted to lieutenant, and in 1913 joined the 3-year-long officers training program at the Prussian War Academy. However, he only got to complete 1 year of the program as World War I broke out in 1914 and all officers were ordered to be deployed to the various fronts. At first, Manstein took part in the offensive into Belgium with the 2nd Guard Reserve Infantry Regiment, in which they captured a heavily fortified citadel which was surrounded by exterior fortifications. Then in September of that year, his unit, as well as one other, were transferred from the 2nd Guards Infantry Regiment to the Eastern Front and attached to the 8th Army, which was commanded by none other than Paul von Hindenburg. There he was part of an attack on an entrenched Russian unit, in which he was shot in the shoulder and the leg. After he was sent to the hospital back in Germany, he was able to report for duty again by June 1915. He was then transferred to the 10th Army and was promoted to captain under Max von Gallwitz. There he learned firsthand how to conduct and plan offensive operations against entrenched enemies as the Germans won victory after victory in Poland, Lithuania, Montenegro, and Albania. He was then reassigned as a supply officer under General Fritz von Below and Fritz von Lossberg on the River Somme. Yeah, you know, this place. British and French offensives in 1916 forced the Germans back to the Hindenburg Line, which is pretty much a camper's paradise, jam-packed with trenches, barbed wire, artillery, machine gun positions, and snipers' nests. He served here for a few months, but was then transferred yet again, this time back to the Eastern Front as the Chief of Staff of the 4th Cavalry Regiment, which was stationed as a garrison unit in Riga. When the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed, Manstein's unit was no longer needed, so he was, again, transferred to the 213th Infantry Regiment on the Western Front. Although his regiment was able to repel British, French, and even American offensives, the rest of the German army was losing the war, and the armistice was signed on November the 11th, 1918. Between this time and World War II, he didn't really do much. He got a girlfriend, married her after only knowing her for 3 days, and remained in the German military as one of only 4,000 officers allowed in the German military per the Treaty of Versailles. He quickly and on multiple occasions proved himself to be a highly capable officer and was eventually promoted to Generalstab des Heeres, which is the equivalent of now becoming the football player who throat-goats the water boy after a homecoming loss. He also encouraged his fellow German high command members to usher in a new era of warfare led primarily by armored units. This caused him to come into contact with Heinz Guderian, who was the main mind behind the concept of blitzkrieg. By the time World War II came around, Manstein was essentially the head of the German military. Since he did pretty much everything, I'll only be covering his highlights from here on out. First, let's talk about Fall Gelb, or the invasion of France. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Hitler had not anticipated France or Britain declaring war on Germany, let alone both. When this happened, the Germans were severely underprepared for war with 2 global superpowers. After the Polish government had evacuated and the country had all but collapsed, the Germans started moving to prepare for war against the 2 superpowers. However, the Germans had taken pretty substantial casualties during the Polish campaign, losing a quarter of its aircraft, over 16,000 soldiers, and proving that the Panzer Is and Panzer IIs weren't at all competent. As his first chance to prove himself, Manstein stepped in and altered the initial battle plans. The Germans had planned on dusting off the old Schlieffen plan and attacking France through the lowlands again. However, Manstein knew the French and British were expecting this and had already placed over 100 divisions numbering over 1 million men on the border of France and Belgium. In addition, combat over the border of France and Germany was impossible for Germany due to the French construction of the Maginot Line, which was pretty much the same thing as the Hindenburg Line but contained a third of the 5 million soldiers in the French army and the biggest guns ever constructed up until that point. Manstein proposed that rather than attacking straight through Belgium and the Netherlands as planned, the Germans' main thrust should be through the Ardennes forest, which was only lightly guarded because it was considered impassable to large armies, especially tanks. After much debate, Manstein's plan was approved by Hitler. It worked like a dream. The Germans launched their diversionary attack into Belgium and the Netherlands, which drew the majority of the British and French forces into the countries to help defend. The Germans then launched their main attack through the Ardennes, cutting off 2/3 of the French army and the entire British expeditionary force. Since the remaining third of the French army was stuck manning the Maginot Line, the way to Paris was pretty much wide open for the Germans. Even though the British expeditionary force escaped at Dunkirk, Manstein still managed to encircle and destroy the most prestigious and powerful French armies while sustaining minimal casualties. Now let's fast forward 3 years to the Third Battle of Kharkov. For a few months now, the Wehrmacht has been losing to the Soviets on the Eastern Front, and things are starting to look pretty desperate for the Germans. When the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, Operation Star, and Operation Gallop simultaneously, they broke through the German lines at several points and encircled the entire German 6th Army at Stalingrad. In order to pull victory out of the ass of the Soviet bear, the German high command turned to the one person who they thought could do it, Manstein. When Manstein was put in charge of the situation, the Soviets in the area outnumbered his forces more than 5-1. He mustered all the forces he could and went to work. Rather than engaging the Soviets at every point he could, he actually lightly guarded the areas that he knew the Soviets would attack. He would let the Soviet armies create a huge bulge in the German front line, drawing the Soviets into small encounters and then retreating, slowly drawing the Soviet forces further and further away from their supply centers. Eventually, they were low on supplies and were stretched very thin. Let me give you a visual representation of what this looks like. As you can see, the Soviets had way more troops than the Germans at first, all condensed into one invincible juggernaut. As the Soviets advanced, however, their forces had to cover a wider front, thus spreading them super thin. Manstein would then use this as an opportunity and went on the attack. He would attack the rear of the bulge, encircling and destroying whatever Soviet forces were surrounded. He repeated this several times, which completely halted the Soviet offensive in the south. What used to be 6 fully equipped and experienced Soviet armies were reduced to 3 battered and broken armies by Manstein. This strategy worked so well, in fact, that he was even able to retake Kharkov, which was an important strategic point in the area. In total, the Soviets lost 52 divisions totaling 82,000 soldiers, while the Germans had only lost a measly 11,000 men. Finally, let's talk about the Battle of Kursk. As a direct result of Manstein's actions at Kharkov, the Soviets, battered and broken, were forced to retreat to Kursk to take up defensive positions. Manstein wanted to capitalize on the advantages created by his victories and rip the heart out of the Soviets in the south by capturing Kursk and destroying the remaining Soviet armies there. However, Hitler himself forbade Manstein from doing so until the German forces had been reinforced with a number of the new Panzer V Panther tanks and the Ferdinand tank destroyers. In the 4 months between Manstein's victories at Kharkov and the launch of Operation Citadel, which was the code name for the attack on Kursk, the Germans were able to refit and reinforce their forces for the assault. However, this also allowed the Soviets to turn the bulge into a defensive shit show. It was pretty much a mini Hindenburg line, except the defensive lines were built to wear down German armored thrusts, which were the key to Manstein's victories. By now, however, Manstein had changed his mind and was now an antagonist to Operation Citadel due to the heavy Soviet fortifications and the limited number of troops he had. Nevertheless, he was given the order to continue with the operation. Despite encountering ring after ring of Soviet fortifications and defenses, Manstein was the only field marshal out of the 3 assigned to the task to make progress. After a few days, he was the only one still making progress, with General Hermann Hoth spearheading the attack. Eventually, Manstein punched through the Soviet defenses and reached the outskirts of the village of Prokhorovka. This would be the battleground for the largest tank battle that would ever take place, and still to this day is the largest tank battle that has ever taken place. For 3 grueling days, the Germans and Soviets would duke it out, but in reality the Soviet tanks stood little chance. They were fighting German Panzer IVs, Panthers, and even the monstrous Tiger tanks, and at range, which was the German tanks' biggest advantage. While this was a strategic miracle pulled off by Manstein, his victory was short-lived. Before he could push the initiative and continue his drive into Soviet territory, the British and Americans landed in Sicily. Hitler was forced to divert Manstein's reserves to Italy to help, which completely paralyzed Manstein into a defensive stature. As you can imagine, this enraged Manstein to no end. The arguments between Hitler and Manstein that followed caused Manstein to be fired, only to be reappointed again to try and save Germany from the Russians, which were encroaching on Berlin. By then, however, it was too late. So in the end, not even a strategic mind rivaling those of Napoleon Bonaparte and Alexander the Great was able to save the Third Reich. However, due to the quality and utter skill demonstrated by the Third Reich's generals, the Allies and Comintern both suffered inexplicably heavy casualties, with the Allied and Comintern powers suffering a combined amount of casualties of around 15 million, with the Germans only suffering around 3.5 million dead. So yeah, that's about it.